Washington has just been jolted by a demand that cuts into one of the oldest and most sensitive secrets in American foreign policy. More than 20 Democratic members of the House have jointly pressed Secretary of State Marco Rubio and the Trump administration to explain what Washington has avoided publicly acknowledging for more than half a century: how many nuclear weapons Israel may actually possess, and what the United States truly knows about them. This is not a routine congressional letter. It lands at a moment when the Middle East is already under extreme strain, and it forces into public view a subject that American officials have long handled through silence, ambiguity, and carefully chosen language. What had been treated for decades as an open secret is now being turned into a direct political confrontation inside Washington. The core issue is simple, even if the implications are not. Much of the world has long assumed that Israel has a nuclear arsenal, and outside assessments have frequently cited an estimated stockpile of roughly 90 warheads. Yet the official position of the United States has for decades remained deliberately vague, avoiding formal confirmation while also avoiding serious pressure for full transparency. What makes this moment different is timing. In the spring of 2026, with regional tensions escalating and fears of wider war spreading, lawmakers are no longer treating nuclear ambiguity as a theoretical issue. They are treating it as an immediate strategic danger that could drag the United States into a crisis it may not fully control. According to the concerns laid out by these lawmakers, the problem is no longer only whether Israel has nuclear weapons. The problem is whether Washington understands the conditions under which those weapons might be used, how secure the relevant facilities are under wartime pressure, and whether the United States has been given a clear picture of the red lines that could trigger a catastrophic escalation. That concern intensified after reports in late March that Iranian missiles landed near sensitive Israeli sites, including areas around Dimona. For years, Israeli strategic infrastructure was often presented in Western discourse as nearly impenetrable, protected by advanced air defenses and layers of deterrence. The recent strikes did not prove a nuclear breach, but they did weaken the image of total invulnerability. That shift matters. Once a supposedly untouchable strategic site is shown to be reachable, even indirectly, the political meaning changes. A facility that had been discussed in abstract terms becomes a live variable in wartime risk. Calculations not only for Israel, but also for every country tied to Israel's defense posture. The lawmakers reportedly listed 11 major questions in their communication. They did not stop at asking for a clearer understanding of Israel's nuclear capabilities. They also sought answers about whether weapons-grade material is still being produced, whether key facilities remain outside meaningful international oversight, and whether the United States has full visibility into the decision-making architecture surrounding any potential nuclear use. That last point is the one with the deepest strategic consequences. If the United States is militarily and politically bound to Israel, but lacks complete knowledge of the circumstances under which Israel might escalate to nuclear use, then Washington is exposed to a severe information gap at the very center of alliance management. In plain terms, it would be backing a partner while not fully knowing where that partner's ultimate red line actually lies. The fear behind that question is not difficult to understand. If a government under extreme military pressure concludes that its survival is at stake, it may behave in ways that are difficult even for allies to predict. In that scenario, the United States could find itself tied to decisions that it neither initiated nor fully anticipated, yet would still be expected to absorb the geopolitical and military consequences. That is why this letter matters beyond partisan symbolism. It suggests that within Washington, at least some lawmakers believe unconditional deference to long-standing strategic ambiguity is no longer sustainable. Once members of Congress begin publicly demanding answers about an ally's most guarded capabilities, the underlying trust structure is already under strain. To understand why this became possible, the timeline matters. The policy often described as nuclear ambiguity did not emerge by accident. It was shaped by a quiet understanding reached in the late 1960s, widely associated with the Nixon administration, under which Israel would not openly declare or visibly test nuclear weapons, and the United States would avoid forcing a public reckoning. That arrangement served several purposes at once. It allowed Israel to retain deterrent value without formal admission. It allowed Washington to preserve the appearance of support for global non-proliferation while avoiding a direct confrontation with one of its closest regional partners, and it gave both sides room to operate without triggering an immediate rupture in diplomatic language. But the arrangement always came with a contradiction. The United States has spent decades pressuring other states in the Middle East over nuclear ambitions, often invoking international law, regional stability, and non-proliferation norms. At the same time, Israel's presumed arsenal remained outside the ordinary framework of public scrutiny, treaty pressure, and full international inspection. That contradiction is one reason this issue now carries such explosive political force. Once nuclear ambiguity is challenged publicly, the old balancing act becomes much harder to sustain. The question is no longer confined to analysts and specialists. It becomes a test of whether Washington can keep defending exceptional treatment while also claiming consistent principles. There is also a domestic political layer that cannot be ignored. These lawmakers are not acting in a vacuum, and they are not operating solely from abstract concern for disarmament. In a highly polarized capital, raising the nuclear issue now also places the Trump administration in a difficult position with no easy exit. If the administration were to openly acknowledge that Israel possesses nuclear weapons, it would crack a long-maintained policy structure and provoke questions across the Middle East. Regional partners such as Saudi Arabia and Turkey would inevitably reassess the credibility and fairness of American policy. The result could be a surge in strategic mistrust and possibly new pressure for regional nuclear hedging. If, on the other hand, the administration continues to deny, deflect, or refuse meaningful comment, that silence becomes politically expensive in a different way. Critics can argue that the White House is ignoring obvious risks while American forces and interests remain exposed to the consequences of regional escalation. In that framing, ambiguity starts to look less like prudence and more like negligence. That is why this pressure campaign is so effective. It creates a trap in which either answer is costly, while non-answer is costly as well. For lawmakers seeking leverage over the administration's Middle East policy, it is a powerful way to expose the gap between public rhetoric and strategic reality. Yet the larger issue may be even darker than Washington's internal struggle. The concern many analysts raise is that Israel's presumed nuclear capability is not simply a hidden deterrent sitting passively in the background. It is part of a wider strategic architecture that includes air delivery systems, land-based missiles, and a sea-based second strike capability often discussed in connection with submarine platforms. In strategic language, that points to a form of nuclear triad, even if the details remain officially unconfirmed. If such a structure exists, it means the issue is not merely whether Israel has nuclear weapons, but whether it has a survivable and flexible deterrent posture designed for worst-case scenarios. That changes how every adversary, ally, and financial market actor interprets the region. The concept often invoked in these discussions is the so-called Samson option, the idea that in an existential crisis, Israel might be prepared to impose unbearable costs on its enemies, even at extraordinary risk to itself. Whether described literally, symbolically, or rhetorically, the idea has haunted regional calculations for decades. It suggests that deterrence and desperation can begin to overlap. From Washington's perspective, that overlap is deeply unsettling. A capability intended to deter adversaries can also become a source of anxiety for allies if those allies are not certain how close a partner may be to invoking it. In that sense, ambiguity may protect deterrence on one level while creating instability on another. And this is where the argument moves from military logic into financial logic. Nuclear danger does not have to become actual nuclear detonation to shake the global system. Even the perception that a strategic site is vulnerable, that escalation thresholds are unclear, or that a regional war could disrupt energy flows is enough to trigger massive economic stress. Israel itself would not be insulated from that. If capital begins to treat the country as a high-risk zone, money can leave faster than politicians can respond. Investors are rarely patient in wartime, and they are even less patient when uncertainty touches strategic infrastructure, energy routes, and long-term sovereign stability. A limited strike near a sensitive site, even without confirmed contamination, can alter market behavior immediately. Currency pressure rises, insurance costs rise, emergency spending rises, central banks come under pressure to stabilize confidence while private capital quietly looks for safer ground. That is the cold arithmetic behind every security crisis. Now widen that lens to the whole region. The Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and the Strait of Hormuz are not peripheral waterways. They are central arteries of global energy and maritime trade. If a nuclear-related scare were to spread across those routes, shipping insurers would react quickly, freight costs would surge, and commercial traffic could slow dramatically. Even before any formal blockade or direct attack took place, oil prices in that scenario would not rise in a gentle or orderly way. They could spike violently, with market psychology amplifying every rumor and every operational delay. Once energy costs surge, the effect spreads outward into transport, electricity, agriculture, manufacturing, and household essentials. A regional military crisis becomes a global inflation shock with extraordinary speed. That is why the question does not end at the battlefield. It reaches into supermarkets, fuel bills, supply chains, and public budgets around the world. What looks at first like a distant security dispute can turn into a broad transfer of wealth through price shocks, scarcity premiums, and panic-driven market repricing. For decades, crises of this kind often drove global capital toward the United States, strengthening demand for dollars and treasury assets. But some observers now argue that this pattern is less automatic than it once was. If the United States is viewed not as a stabilizing distance power, but as directly entangled with the source of escalation, then the safe haven reflex could become less reliable. That is one reason this issue alarms not only anti-war voices, but also elements of the American strategic and financial establishment. If a Middle East nuclear scare becomes inseparable from perceptions of American liability, then the United States may no longer be able to reap the traditional financial benefits of global insecurity. Instead, it could inherit the costs of sponsorship without the comfort of unquestioned confidence. This is where the geopolitical field widens again. Iran has already tested the edges of Israeli deterrence by striking near sensitive sites without crossing into all-out nuclear escalation. From Tehran's point of view, that may have been more than retaliation. It may have been a strategic probe designed to measure how far pressure can go before Israel or the United States decides the costs are intolerable. If that interpretation is correct, then the result was significant. Israel absorbed the shock without resorting to nuclear signaling beyond its established posture. That outcome may encourage opponents to believe that sustained, conventional pressure, calibrated carefully enough, can impose growing costs while staying below the threshold of terminal escalation. That kind of pressure is dangerous precisely because it is incremental. It does not arrive as one decisive blow. It arrives as a slow process of attrition, uncertainty, and psychological erosion. And because it remains just below the most catastrophic threshold, it can continue for far longer than a single dramatic clash. Russia, meanwhile, benefits whenever the United States becomes more deeply absorbed by a draining Middle East crisis. Moscow does not need to intervene openly in order to gain strategic advantage. Even limited support, selective cooperation, or the simple prolongation of American distraction can shift pressure away from other theaters and expose the burden of American overextension. China's advantage, if one follows the broader strategic argument, is different. Beijing does not need to match military drama with military drama. It can present itself as the architect of alternative financial and trade arrangements, especially if partners begin seeking channels less exposed to war risk, sanctions exposure, or dollar system vulnerability. In that context, every new regional shock becomes more than a military event. It becomes a marketing event for competing systems of payment, energy settlement, and commercial infrastructure. If the American-led order appears tied to instability, then rival frameworks gain appeal simply by appearing more insulated and predictable. That does not mean the dollar system is about to collapse overnight. It does mean that repeated crises erode confidence at the margins, and global monetary systems change first at the edges before they change at the center. Strategic overreach has a way of showing up in markets long before it shows up in official doctrine. So what happens next? The letter from more than 20 House Democrats is unlikely by itself to force Israel into transparency or disarmament. It is equally unlikely to produce a sudden confession from the Trump administration on the narrow question of immediate policy reversal. expectations should remain modest. But on the deeper question, the letter may already have done something important. It has made visible the distrust that had previously been managed behind closed doors. Once that distrust enters the public sphere, the relationship between Washington and Tel Aviv becomes harder to describe as seamless and harder to defend as strategically uncomplicated. From that point forward, three broad outcomes begin to look more plausible. First, Israel may grow even more strategically anxious, a state that feels militarily pressured and politically criticized and financially exposed rarely becomes calmer. It often becomes more forceful in signaling resolve, more insistent on support, and more resistant to outside restraint. Second, the Middle East may slide further into a prolonged condition of high-cost instability, even without a nuclear detonation. The fear of escalation alone can keep shipping under stress, keep investors cautious, keep insurance expensive, and keep military spending elevated. In many ways, the region does not need to reach the worst-case scenario in order to suffer many of its economic effects. Third, the era of unquestioned American dominance in the Middle East may be entering a more visible phase of decline, not because the United States lacks military power, but because power depends on control or credibility and narrative coherence. When allies, adversaries, lawmakers, and markets all begin questioning whether Washington still controls the strategic logic of its own alignment structure, dominance becomes harder to sustain. That is the real significance of this moment. A debate that once lived in the shadows has broken into the open at exactly the time when the costs of ambiguity are rising. The issue is no longer merely whether Israel's nuclear capability exists. The issue is whether the old system built around not speaking of it can survive the pressure now bearing down on the region. There is no guarantee that exposure leads to reform. Sometimes exposure leads only to harsher denial, deeper mistrust, and more dangerous improvisation. But once the first layer of silence is broken, the political system cannot easily return to innocence. So the immediate question is not whether peace is suddenly at hand, it is whether Washington can continue managing a policy of selective opacity while military risk, domestic polarization, regional rivalry, and global economic fragility all intensify at the same time. That is a far harder task than preserving a diplomatic formula during quieter decades. In the end, this story is about more than one ally, one administration, or one letter. It is about the limits of strategic ambiguity in an age when wars are faster, markets are more reactive, and political secrecy breaks down under public pressure more easily than before. The older order depended on silence, discipline, and distance. All three are now weakening, and that is why this confrontation matters. More than 20 lawmakers have not simply asked an awkward question. They have forced Washington to face the possibility that one of its longest-running geopolitical fictions may now be colliding with reality at the worst possible time. What follows next will shape not only the future of the Middle East, but also the credibility of American power far beyond it.